Well, a local news story here where I live in Florida is making national news this morning as the rest of the country learns of the impending doom known as Piney Point. There seems to be a lot of misinformation going on around a lot of people who, because now the national media is trying to pick up on the story and talk about it, and I figured I'd clear up a few things, and I'm not an expert on it. I mean, but people generally in this part of Florida are familiar with the situation. It's it's an ongoing saga. It's been a problem for decades, and now it seems like it's the government has kicked the can down the road one too many times, and they're trying to pass the buck to this private real estate investment firm, HRK Holdings, who has controlled the site since like '06. Apparently has not worked either because they were unable to avert this disaster. But the basic situation is that you have an old fertilizer plant. I assume that there was a phosphate mine on this site at some point, although the area, well, no, not really. The area doesn't really look like a phosphate mine. But at the very least, they were processing phosphate, turning it into fertilizer. And so the byproduct from that is essentially liquid fertilizer. You have water with dissolved nitrogen and phosphorus, which is sustaining life currently, the pool that they are worried about bursting. These ponds, well, first of all, another issue is that these ponds are not at ground level. These are not ponds that are dug into the ground. These are built up off the ground. And so if you've ever driven by one of these wastewater ponds at any phosphate facility, any phosphate processing facility in Florida, you'll know that there are these massive berms that stick out of the ground, which look very unnatural because this part of the state is totally flat. Pretty much once you get south of Tampa, the whole state of Florida is a flat plain. There are no hills. But occasionally you'll see one of these big berms along a road that might run for a half mile or so, and that berm is keeping back all of this water that is laced with nitrogen and phosphorus. And so, Mosaic, for example, which is a phosphate mining company, very powerful politically here in Florida. They have lots and lots of money. They put out these TV ads that show how they're, trying to take these ponds and turn them back into like some sort of a natural ecosystem that sustains life. And they show, oh, look here, lily pads and ducks and fish. They stock the ponds with fish, and they try and turn them into something that is not something other than a toxic waste dump, which is what they are. And over time, they do clean them up. So, like I said, this particular pond that is leaking, the walls of these facilities are made from gypsum, which is a byproduct of phosphate. They're calling it radioactive. Actually, a lot of the national media now is saying that the water is radioactive. That's totally false. The water is not radioactive, at least nobody's ever told us that it's radioactive. I mean, people can, take their boats in old phosphate pits and, they touch the water, and I've never, nobody's ever been scared of getting cancer or something like that from the water. However, the gypsum, I guess, is slightly radioactive. I'm not sure if it's radioactive enough to really be much of an issue, but, let's say that it is, that would be a concern. But the water itself is not poisonous. It's not going to kill you. The problem with the water in this pond, and there are other ponds on the site, and I'll get to that in a minute. This pond, because there's so much phosphorus and nitrogen in the water, it could cause an algae bloom, which could lead to all sorts of disruptions in the ecosystem of Tampa Bay, which is where the water would drain into. There was a lot of talk about this a couple years ago, back in 2018, which was a particularly bad year for red tide. People blamed it on fertilizer runoff. They blamed it on sugar farmers in the middle of the state draining off their irrigation water into the Kissimmee River, which goes down into Lake Okeechobee and then spreads out through various rivers into the Gulf of Mexico. There was controversy around that. I'm not particularly convinced that that 2018 was just a particularly bad year for fertilizer runoff, and that's why red tide was so bad. I think that red tide comes and goes. Some years are worse than others. 2018 was not the worst year by any means. You have a problem here in Florida that there aren't a lot of people who have lived here for a long time, and so you have a lot of people who have just moved here. Like I remember distinctly back in 2018, someone who was on the news being interviewed, and she said, I just moved here, 2 years ago, and this is the worst I've ever seen it. Like as if that means anything. Oh yeah, you've been here for 2 years, and wow, this is the worst you've ever seen it. Well, yeah, red tide ebbs and flows from year to year. So, some years are really bad, some years you hardly notice it. But if you dump this much, essentially liquid fertilizer into the bay all at once, it's gonna create some issues. I don't know if that issue will be red tide, but I mean, even if it's just making algae bloom, it causes problems because you get all this algae floating in the water, which looks nasty, and it'll block the sunlight, which will I believe prevent the aquatic plants from producing oxygen and oxygenating the water, which would lead to a lot of dead fish, which I believe is different from how red tide works, because I think red tide, the algae there, actually produces a toxin that kills the fish. So that's the reason why they've been trying to keep all this water penned up in this big man-made pond that is 30 feet above the surface. It goes up 30 feet, and so you've kind of got a wall keeping back all this water. And so if the wall breaks, the problem then becomes that not only is that water going to drain into the bay, which they're actually trying to drain into the bay right now. They're pumping it out into the bay as fast as they can just to stop the whole thing from collapsing, because if it collapses, well, then you've got 30 feet of water then that's going to spread out across the surrounding area, which would, create some pretty serious sudden flooding. And so that's why we're seeing the evacuations that we are. Now, luckily, not a ton of people live in northwest Manatee County. It's a pretty nice area, I think, because there aren't a lot of people there. Although some people are starting to move in, they're finally starting to do a lot of construction there and put in these, horrible modern suburban neighborhoods. But so far, really none of those are under threat. They did extend the evacuation order down to Moxonwalla Road, where there is a lot of construction, but just not on this part of the road. But who knows? Maybe this whole controversy and this whole situation will poison the well a bit, so to speak. Not literally, hopefully, but figuratively when it comes to real estate in the area. And maybe builders will not want to build so much in this area. I guess that could be a nice silver lining of the whole situation. But there is a potential... There is a more potential risk than just this pond breaking open and flooding the surrounding area and then draining into the bay and causing an algae bloom. It gets worse, and that is because there are other ponds on the site that are not currently leaking, but could be destabilized if this one ruptures and suddenly floods out in the area. It could wash away the walls and erode them of the other ponds. And those ponds, according to the company that is managing the site currently, HRK Holdings, those ponds are not sustaining life. So that would lead us to believe that water is probably toxic to some degree. And so if that gets into the bay, that may very well, just kill off a lot of life forms. And so they'd much rather dump all this water out of the pond that's leaking into the bay, rather than trying to, dam up the leak and then have it fail again, only to wash away the other ponds with it and, take all that horrible water out there. So it's a pretty tense situation. They've shut down Highway 41, which, I guess isn't that important anymore since the interstate exists, but once upon a time was a a pretty important trade route. Now, I guess what makes this situation so unique is that you normally don't see these big phosphate plants right on the water. Typically in Florida, waterfront property or anything near the water, is highly coveted for housing. Those are really our two industries we have here. We have fertilizer, we've got sugar, we have housing. Citrus has been dying for decades. Hopefully it'll come back. I actually like the citrus industry. But housing clearly is the dominant player these days, even though the fertilizer and the sugar lobby has plenty of power in order to keep themselves afloat. But since normally these plants are so far inland, you wouldn't really worry so much about directly contaminating Tampa Bay. Maybe these, you might have a plant near a river or something, but it would, there would be a lot of ground that water would have to cover before making it, out into the ocean. And theoretically, the land should act as a natural filter to try and stop a lot of the toxins from making their way into the Gulf. But this plant, of course, is just across 41 from the water. They're literally running a hose from the pond out into Port Manatee, which is on Tampa Bay, to pump the water out of this pond and try and drain it. And so as far as, I guess, the government response to this goes and who's responsible, this is a problem that's many decades old. Everyone who has, tried to deal with it in the past has essentially, passed the buck on to the next guy. And so it's hard to blame anyone in particular. To me, the common sense thing of because I haven't looked enough into this to really understand the full details. Nobody really has. But, the common sense thing that local people have always said about it is like, why don't they just drain it if the water's such a problem? If you have time, if you know that it's stable, it's been stable for decades, this site, why not just start draining the water out slowly, pumping it into trucks and trucking it away somewhere to be processed? Because at least this big pond that we're talking about, the biggest pond here, the water's not bad. It's just got fertilizer in it. And so, heck, you can bottle it and sell it as liquid fertilizer. Although they did say it was slightly acidic, so maybe they'd have to treat it to try and neutralize the pH. But, other than that, this stuff isn't that bad. Just get it out of there. Because when you have, it's only natural that water wants to spread out. Water doesn't like to be kept and forced vertically upwards 30 feet above, sea level, above the ground. And so what goes up must come down eventually. And so I don't know the details. Maybe this HRK Holdings company has a contract with the state just to maintain the status quo. Maybe that's, because what they essentially want to do is to develop the land around it into industrial, for industrial use. And essentially, they're just sort of trying to maintain these ponds so that they don't burst and, and flood everywhere. So they've been building around here. And so I guess they're, supposed to say, okay, well, that's enough incentive for them to try and do their best to maintain this. And, I would agree. They don't want to have all of their real estate that they've developed, all of their industrial warehouses and things, their industrial park, be destroyed because they weren't maintaining this pond properly. But again, if you're HRK Holdings, why not drain it? What is the reason why the water's had to stay here? Because they have a plastic liner in these ponds, and so the water is not being, it's not like whatever the toxins are in this are being filtered through the ground. It's not going into the ground. The phosphorus and the nitrogen, which are not toxins themselves, they're not being able to, reintegrate back into the soil. And so this whole situation is just stagnant. It's not going to improve on its own, I don't believe. So it was just inevitable that something like this was going to happen eventually. But at this point, it's too late. So I wish anybody who lives in the area well, and hopefully your house doesn't get washed away. I do know a few people who live within a few miles of this plant, but I don't think that their houses are in danger from what I understand. So I'll end it there.